straight and level time and minimizing your turn time.
And how long would these things stay up there for?
So from my experience, from our experience, and again, we weren't studying these, but they were always out there. You know, they were
Always.
out there when we took off, we'd see them, and then we go to land, they would still be out there.
Like every day?
Every day.
Every day?
Every day.
So you guys go from not having any idea that these things are out there to an upgraded radar system to seeing them every day.
Yeah.
What is the thought? Like, how are you feeling when these, like, is there an evolution of the thought pattern of how you're addressing these things and thinking about them? Initially, you're thinking they're errors. When do you start getting a thought that, like, what the fuck is this thing?
Yeah. So that happened when we visually saw one. And the first time we visually saw one, the object was directly at what we call the entry point of the area. So, you know, that box that I told you about in the sky that starts 10 miles off the coast, there's a particular GPS, you know, location and altitude where incoming traffic will fly in, and outbound traffic will fly in the exact same spot, but will fly out 1,000 feet lower. There were 2 aircraft from my squadron, VFA-11, and we flew, or excuse me, they flew, took off as a flight of 2. That means they're essentially flying in a formation like this. And as they hit the area, one of these objects went right between the aircraft. The lead air crew saw the object. The Dash 2 aircraft crew did not, which is not surprising because they're usually, you know, you're very focused on flying formation. You're just staring right at that aircraft. The lead really has actual leeway to look around. So he saw it, and, you know, he immediately came back. I have to assume he didn't have it on his radar because he wouldn't have flown through this object at the entrance point. He turned around, flew back, landed, and I was in the ready room when he come back, and, you know, he had all his gear on, which typically is not a good thing because you want to get that stuff off as fast as possible. So usually means, you know, there's a problem of some nature. And, you know, he was just sitting there saying, hey, you know, I was hit with those damn things. And we all knew what he was referring to, even though we didn't necessarily have a name for it, just because we were seeing these so much. And he described it. You know, he described it just as a black or dark gray cube, and that cube was inside of a clear or translucent sphere. And essentially, the apex or the corners of that cube, best he could tell, were touching that inside of that sphere.
And that description mirrors many of the descriptions that people have had of these, whatever you want to call them. Whether they're calling them UAPs now for some strange reason. UFOs is I don't know, does it have a dirty connotation to it? And is it tainted because of so many crazy people talk about UFOs? Is that what it is?
It does come with a lot of assumptions baked in.
It baked in. That's, yeah. So that's something, but whatever it is, that is a design that people have reported seeing before. That this translucent sphere and this cube, can you see through the cube?
Not to my understanding, no.
So it's some sort of solid black cube that's inside this translucent sphere, and it's just floating around and flying around the sky.
So, you know, that's a good point. Is it floating around? Is it flying around? It's doing both, which is strange, right? Because you could think of that description and go, okay, that's kind of some kind of weird balloon maybe with stuff in it. And that's certainly, you know, one way. If you just view that angle of it, then it seems explainable. But when that, you know, the balloon-like object starts cruising down at, you know, 0.8 Mach, you know, that nullifies that particular idea. And you'll see that a lot where it's not just like that one picture, that one behavior. It's really, you kind of have to zoom out a bit and look at everything in relation to each other and say, okay, why is this weird? You know, okay, it was hanging out in a racetrack pattern. That's not exotic. But when you learned it was doing it for, you know, perhaps 13 hours.
13 hours?
You know, perhaps they were out there all the time, you know. So, you know, I land and I go back. And we weren't on a Intel mission to analyze these, right? We're going to do our training. It's very expensive, $30K an hour to fly these things, right? So really the only time we can put energy into looking at these things is when we're kind of transiting back and forth or waiting for a fight to start. And so, you know, it's never like a dedicated analysis. One of the problems I've had is that, you know, people haven't wanted to look into and to study this topic. And people ask me all the time, okay, you know, what were you seeing on the jet? What were you seeing in the radar? I want to be able to tell them that there was a great thing that we saw, but an F-18 is not a scientific tool, right? We only get presented a certain amount of information when all the sensors essentially filter all the data out so that we can prosecute the targets and do our job. It's not some type of like analog, information we receive. So, just because, say, something is showing jamming on my radar from one of these objects doesn't mean the object is executing, electronic warfare to jam my jet. It just means that, it's doing something to our radar signal, and when it comes back, our jet is processing it like it's EW. So we need to get proper scientific tools to do an analysis on these objects instead of basing, a lot of our analysis right now just on tools of war that aren't built for that.
Right. How long can you guys stay up in an F-18?
If we're dogfighting, about an hour. If we're holding at 0.6 to 0.8 Mach, like I described them as doing, somewhere maybe around like 2.5 hours maximum.
And you think that these things are up there for far longer than that?
Mm-hmm.
So how big was this thing when this guy saw it?
So it's very difficult to tell in the air, but because they were flying in formation, we can make some estimated guesses essentially, and that's what we did when we talked about it afterwards, right? So the aircraft were about 100 feet apart. This thing, they estimate it essentially split the section, which means it went more or less right down the middle, but slightly closer to lead, which would put it somewhere less than 50 feet, on average, if they're about 100 feet. And then he essentially used that size reference to say, hey, this might have been somewhere in like the 5 to 15, foot diameter. It's, not a tight guess, but that's the best we could come up with.
And what is it like? Like what's the atmosphere like when you go back to the base? Are you allowed to discuss this? Is this something that's openly talked about? Is this something that you get ridiculed for?
It's just, like you would expect any group of, dude and dudettes, hearing about this to just kind of, do the normal reaction like anyone else and to kind of, make the jokes and then kind of get back to work essentially because, we're just so busy at this time, right? We're getting ready for war. Like for a lot of us, this is the apex of our career sense to get ready for deployment, and it's kind of like the long blade gets cut in a sense in a fighter community like that. It's very much a trust-based organization. So, no one's out there looking to like make a big deal out of something that's completely irrelevant, in our eyes to our day-to-day operations other than a safety risk. That's really like as much as we could process it. So yeah, there was ridicule, but I don't think it was, I wouldn't say it was like over the top or emotionally damaging, but, it made it clear it wasn't something to like, we were going to like put serious thought and energy into. It was, hey, yeah, stay away and, let me know how you did in that next fight, essentially.